Hello, my name is Michael Lambert, and today, being the third anniversary of the day we broke free from the wicked, evil, corrupt, dishonest, criminal cabal or mafia-style organisation, which had been bossing us around and telling us what to do and making our laws for 45 years, and also on the brink of, on the cusp of us becoming a world-class technology superpower and the envy of the world. I thought I'd look back at the history of Brexit. Now, I'm relying for my source material mostly on this very famous, now world famous, academic work, which describes in great detail our experiences in joining the EU and what effect it had and what the consequences were for us all. So we joined the EEC, the European Economic Community, in 1973, 50 years ago this month. And in due course, that became the European Union, which is undoubtedly the biggest, richest, most successful trading bloc in the world, a bloc now of 27 countries, of which we were favoured members because we negotiated all sorts of special conditions and opt-outs and so on, and of which we were quite a domineering sort of member. I mean, we were very much involved in all major legislation that took part whilst we were members. Now, in about 1999, a guy called Nigel Farage became a member of the European Parliament. Farage is a guy, sort of used car salesman, a guy who loves the sound of his own voice, and he liked Trump and like Johnson. He very much likes being on the television. He found that he was quite telegenic, and people liked watching him and so on. So he got lots and lots and lots of publicity. For example, he appeared on Question Time more than almost anybody else. I think something like 35 different times, and was able to spout on endlessly about how dreadful the EU was and how we'd be so much better off if only we left. In due course, he formed something called the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, and this, particularly when it came to after the financial crash, and when Cameron and Osborne decided that austerity was the way to go, and people get a bit fed up. A lot of people, particularly the right wing, the Conservative Party, and all the people who listened to Farage started thinking that, the EU is the problem. That was, it's always easy when you're trying to get a movement going to find an enemy, a common enemy, and so the EU became the common enemy. Now, Cameron was a bit worried about this. He thought, well, all these right-wingers are taking our votes, and the UKIP is a danger, and so on. And so he decided that the best way would be to have a referendum, in which case everybody was going to vote or the majority would vote to remain, and then that would see off the UKIP, it would see off his right wing, and everything would be fine. He could just relax then. So he announced that there was going to be a referendum. Now, the people who were in favour of leaving used two particular strategies. One was to frighten everybody about immigration, and the other was to say how much better off we'd be because we wouldn't have to pay money to the EU, and also because we could now do trade deals. We would now be able to do trade deals with countries all over the world. So Farage, for example, he went out and he said if we remained in the EU, Turkey was about to join, and that up to 90 million Turks would be able to come to the UK, would be swamped by Turkish people, and that frightened a lot of people because a lot of people didn't like immigrants. It's very easy to generate dislike of immigrants. It's happened so many times in history, and that was what was happening here. It was all Europeans' fault, coming here, taking our jobs, using the NHS, using our schools, and so on, and not contributing anything, of course. And so that was probably the biggest. The biggest factor that persuaded a lot of people, particularly people who never came across an immigrant ever in their lives, they were persuaded that immigration was a big problem. At the same time, people like Rees-Mogg, for example, the rather ridiculous Rees-Mogg, went around telling people endlessly that if only we left the EU, food, clothing and footwear would be much cheaper. There's even a Daily Mail front page with him saying that the moment we left the EU, food, clothing and footwear would all be at least 20% cheaper. well, we can all see how that worked out. And then, of course, Boris Johnson, a man not famed for his honesty or integrity, went all over the country in the big red bus saying that if we left the EU, we'd save so much money that we'd have £350 million per week to spend on the NHS. That's £18.2 billion a year to spend on the NHS. And people believed all this. And so on the 23rd of June 2016, we had the referendum. And to everyone's surprise, by 52% to 48%, we voted to leave. So David Cameron, he said, well, I'm off now. I mean, I've caused all these problems. I brought about a Brexit, which nobody thought we would vote to leave. Not even Boris Johnson, who appeared to be more shocked than anybody that we'd voted to leave. But he was off. He went off whistling on the steps of Downing Street. And the hapless Theresa May took over as Prime Minister. Now, she was completely out of her depth all along. She couldn't cope with the right wing of the party, and for her it was a really, really, really difficult time, especially as she went for the hardest of Brexits, one where we left the customs union and the single market, despite the fact that this was not actually necessary. And so we began negotiating. First negotiator was David Davis. He went to Brussels. His heart didn't seem to be much in it, and after a while he called it a day. And then we had Dominic Raab, didn't we? He took over, and he the first thing he said when he became our Brexit negotiator was that he had no idea. He'd never realised that Dover to Calais was an important crossing for our trade with the EU. Anyway, Mrs. May, she struggled on a bit, and then in the end she decided, well, best thing was to have a general election so she could have what she called a strong and stable government. That's what she wanted to go for. And so she debated against the leader of the Labour Party, who was then Jeremy Corbyn, a man who was much disliked and feared by a large proportion of the population. But nonetheless, Mrs. May campaigned so badly, and it was such a pathetic campaign that she ended up losing a majority. So she'd had her election to become a strong and stable, and in fact she became weak and unstable. And not only that, not having a majority, she had to do a deal with whoever she could. She did a deal with the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party from Northern Ireland, and that meant giving lots and lots and lots of money to the leader, well, to the party, but the leader of which was a shouty lady called Arlene Foster. And so May limped on with a tiny, tiny majority, thanks to the DUP, for a bit longer. And eventually, in May 2019, she decided she had enough of it, and so she resigned. And in due course, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, promising that he would get Brexit done. His whole message was getting Brexit done. And of course, if Boris Johnson says something, you can bet your life on it. It's going to get done. Now, in order to get Brexit done, Boris Johnson got a guy called David Frost, a guy who'd previously been an ambassador in Denmark or something, a completely and utterly gormless guy who was just a useful idiot, really. Got him to go and negotiate, and he negotiated, and it was all time sensitive because Johnson wanted to be able to announce by the end of the year that he'd got Brexit done. Sure enough, Frost went off to negotiate, and he came back. Yes, he got a deal, including the Northern Ireland Protocol. And Johnson celebrated, everybody celebrated, the deal is done, we're leaving. And within a very short time, it was quite clear that the deal was rubbish. And so David Frost, who by then had become Lord Gormless, he'd become a lord, he was in the House of Lords, and also he was in the cabinet. He went back to the EU and said, I'm sorry, the deal I made was rubbish, can we change it? And they said no, so he looked really, really silly. In due course, we made it known that despite the fact this was an international agreement, we had made it known that we were planning to break this deal in a limited way, a specific and limited way. And so on the 1st of January 2021, we left. We left the EU. And we celebrated being able to take back control, to make our own laws, and to stop all these immigrants, especially Europeans, stop them coming to take all our jobs. And we were able also to make lots and lots of trade deals all over the world. Now, once we were out, we suddenly realized that there was a lot of new paperwork, new bureaucracy, because we were now what's known as a third country. We were no longer members of the EU, and we were to be treated in the same way as every other country in the world that's not a member of the EU. That is to say that whenever we wanted to sell goods to the EU or wanted to buy goods to the EU, there was going to be paperwork. And it turned out there's going to be an awful lot of paperwork, mountains and mountains of paperwork, so that for small and medium-sized businesses, they could no longer trade in the EU, frankly, because customers in the EU were not prepared to put up with the hassle and the expense and the time, the delays and the cost. And likewise, people in the UK wanted to buy from suppliers in the EU found it just too difficult, and so trade between the UK and the EU began to collapse. Firms that were medium size or larger size, they all were able to go and set up branches in the EU. So they went off and they set up branches whereby they were employing people in the EU. Great bonus for the Brexit bonus for the EU, and they're paying taxes in the EU, and some of them moved completely to the EU. So for trade, it became very difficult, or much more difficult. Now, at the same time, we were now free to. We're now free to get trade deals with people all over the world, and we were told time and time again before Brexit that the moment we left, we would be free. Countries would be queuing up to do deals with us. Now, the first international trade secretary was Liz Truss, and she subsequently became foreign secretary, and then, of course, we all know she became prime minister. Now, as international trade secretary, she went all over the world. All over the world trying to get deals, going to Australia, New Zealand, and all sorts of places. Went to Japan, and what she ended up with after I don't know how long it was, a couple of years, was she ended up with two deals, one with Australia, one with New Zealand, whereby we were instead of getting our beef and lamb, sourcing them locally in the UK to help British farmers. No, we would import it from 12,000 miles away, whereby it would be in containers, frozen containers, for 6 weeks at a time. So we would end up with beef and lamb, which was not as good quality as the fresh beef and lamb we had already here in this country. Now, Liz Truss, she was very keen on having a photograph taken because she saw herself, I think, as Mrs. Thatcher. So she went all over the world. At one time, she was posting 40 or 50 photographs a week of herself on Instagram and on Twitter. It was just an avalanche. She doesn't do it anymore, as it happens. I think, as I said before, I think she fancied herself as Mrs. Thatcher. But all she got out of this 2 years as Trade Secretary and Foreign Secretary was just these two miserable deals with Australia and New Zealand. And even now, 3 years on, we haven't got any more trade deals yet. Boris Johnson rather thought he was going to get a deal with the United States. I think he thought he'd go in, he'd give Biden a bit of his charm and his bluster, and that he would easily get a deal with America. Well, as it happens, Biden's Irish by descent, and he was very angry about the Northern Ireland Protocol. He was very angry about the fact we threatened to break the agreement we'd entered into. And so as soon as Johnson approached the subject of a trade deal, he was shown the door. And I think he realised right away that it's going to be many, many years before we ever get a deal with the United States. At the same time, the government, in all their wisdom, have decided that we should try and join the CPTPP. CPTPP is an organisation which is about as far away. It consists of about 12 countries who are all about as far away as you can get without getting to Antarctica. Places like Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Mexico, Vietnam, Peru, and Malaysia. These people we're going to deal with to replace places like Holland and Belgium and France and Italy, which are sort of 2-hour Eurostar away from 2-hour Eurostar journey away from the UK. But nothing seems to have come of that yet. It's still going on. 3 years later, we're still waiting to get a deal with any of these CPTPP countries. Indeed, as I said, after 3 years, we've got no really significant trade deal anywhere. One of the benefits of Brexit was that we don't have to worry about laws concerning things like disposal of sewage and water companies, which are owned by people from all over the world, from places like, even from China. Some are owned by firms in the Cayman Islands, organisations in the Cayman Islands, people in the UAE, Australia, all over the world. There are people who own our water companies, and so it makes it a lot more profitable for a water company to just tip the sewage in the rivers. And so now they're able to do that, and there's not much we can do about it because the EU isn't going to come and meddle with our affairs. The bossy EU telling us we can't do that. So our rivers are being polluted, and the sea is not safe to bathe in any longer. That's just another consequence of Brexit. Now, in terms of other consequences, the fishing industry was very important. It was one of the last items to be discussed before before Johnson got Brexit done. And the fishermen were very keen to be able to fish in more of our waters. We don't have foreign boats coming fishing in our waters. And as a result of the agreement, the idea was that they would gradually be able to fish in more and more of our waters. The only problem was, of course, that because of the additional bureaucracy, the delays in getting our fish to the markets, which were principally in the EU, have made that no longer possible. So we can catch more fish, we can't sell it because a restaurant in Paris doesn't want fish arriving that's been sat on a lorry in Dover or Calais for 3 days. So it's really completely crippled the fishing industry. Now, as soon as we left the EU, officially, finally, on the 1st of January 2021, the EU started imposing controls on all goods going into the EU. So whenever you arrived in Calais or whichever port you arrived at, you had to undergo all these rigorous, extensive controls, all this paperwork and so on, and the goods would be inspected and all the rest of it. But and so it made it very, very much more difficult to export to the EU. But after 6 years, we weren't ready. So we didn't have any controls. So we just let everything through. And the policy was to let all vehicles just come through. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who seemed to get involved somehow or other with all this, he said that having checks on goods coming to the country would be an act of self-harm. And he also said later on that he thought by not imposing controls we're saving a lot of money, which was I think he described as a Brexit bonus actually. And so what you ended up with, because of all these controls of when goods arriving in Europe, you had what we still have now very often is these huge queues of lorries, enormous queues of lorries waiting hours and sometimes days on end to get through customs, and this is a big deterrent to European transport companies to bring goods here, and so exports to the UK are being affected by that as well, by the sheer difficulty of bringing stuff. And of course, not having any controls on goods coming into the country means that people can smuggle. It's an absolute boon for the smuggling industry. You can smuggle anything in because nothing's being checked. Whilst we were members of the EU, we relied a lot upon foreign workers coming and doing some of these jobs that we don't like to do, like dirty jobs like standing in fields digging potatoes and carrots and things and harvesting. And thousands and thousands of workers used to come from places like Bulgaria and Romania and so on. They'd come for a few months and then they go back again. But we of course, once we left the EU, we could put a stop to all that. The only problem was that having put a stop to them coming, we hadn't got anybody to do these jobs. And so this caused quite a few crises, and particularly for farmers, for people who grow fruit and vegetables and so on. many of whom, some resorted to bringing workers even from Vietnam and so on. And there were all sorts of scandals about people being enticed here and then not having enough money to get home and all the rest of it. And some even disappeared into the black economy, apparently. But anyway, there was a huge problem, and a lot of farmers have said, to hell with this. If we can't get anybody to harvest the crop, what's the point in planting? And so that's had a really bad effect upon food production, and will feed through in due course, especially as supplies from Europe are likely to decline once we start imposing controls where it's much more complicated. Likewise, in so many other industries like hospitality and like care homes and nurses, doctors, and as we know about, but the building trade and meat and dairy, and just so many different businesses, industries had been used to using workers who came from the EU. A lot of people say that they were undercutting wages. Everyone was paid minimum wage. There's a legal minimum wage, so it's difficult to see quite how anybody can argue that they were undercutting wages. And now, with the shortage of workers, the government is looking for people to work in the NHS in particular, because there's a desperate shortage there. It's really getting rather serious. And so they're looking all over the world. They're looking in Nigeria and the Philippines and Pakistan and India to try and find people to come here to replace those who used to come from Italy and France and Spain and Germany and so on. Now, given the fact that there weren't any particular benefits of Brexit, Boris Johnson asked Jacob Rees-Mogg if he would have a look and see if he could find some Brexit benefits. So Jacob Rees-Mogg, he decided the best thing to do was ask the people, the readers of the Sun newspaper, and after extensive studies and consulting and reviewing all these suggestions, we came up with various possibilities that could be regarded as benefits of Brexit. Two in particular he mentioned, and I think which are really seriously important. One is that we can now make more powerful vacuum cleaners. The only thing is that if we want to sell these vacuum cleaners in Europe, we can't, because they don't allow them. The other benefit, I think, which he came up with, which is really, it's life-changing, is the fact that inside the Dartford Tunnel, the signs showing the distance to the exit in the event of an emergency, they are now they can now be written in feet and inches instead of meters, which were always so confusing. If you've ever tried to convert yards to meters, it's just impossible. And the other thing, of course, was immigration. Now, the Home Secretary until recently was Priti Patel, a woman whose hatred of immigrants knows no bounds. A woman who, like her successor, Suella Braverman, and like the Prime Minister, like the Deputy Prime Minister, like so many others in the cabinet, are all children of immigrants, and who seem to have an absolutely passionate hatred of immigration. Anyway, she was absolutely determined, was Priti Patel, to keep immigrants out, and she at one stage she wanted to make it a criminal offence to help anybody who was drowning, any asylum seekers who were found to be drowning in the Channel. And she did everything she could. Eventually, she got really cross because the French were not, in her view, doing enough to stop immigrants leaving France. Why they would want to stop them leaving France, I've absolutely no idea. But anyway, so she was getting quite stressed up about it before she got sacked. But she did come up with the idea of sending them all to the middle of Africa and dumping them there. Unfortunately, the Rwandans, which is where she was going to send them, they can only take a total of 200. It's costing something like 120-odd million pounds to take 200 people. And we had something like 40,000 cross the Channel last year. So it's unlikely to be a significant deterrent. Now, in terms of how it's affected us as individuals, when we were members of the EU, we could go and live and work anywhere in 27 different countries. We could retire there, stay as long as we like. We could use the medical services. We could do whatever we wanted, really. It was just no different going to live anywhere in these 27 countries than staying in the UK or living wherever you wanted to in the UK. It was absolutely free. Now, of course, that's all stopped. Also, our young people were able to go, university students were able to go and spend a year or more, a fantastic opportunity, which many people enjoyed. Used to go to the EU and study for a year in a foreign university. That's all come to an end because we ended that. We didn't have to, but we ended that because we said we're going to bring in a better system. We haven't actually got a better system yet. We haven't even come up with much of a system. I think it's something to do with being able to go and study in New Zealand or something. So whereas before you could maybe go and study in a university in Paris or Brussels and you could come home for the weekend on the train if you wanted to. Now, if you go to New Zealand, you're there for a year probably. As we know, as we keep seeing, some of us have experienced, and as we keep seeing pictures of, if you arrive in Europe now, you have to queue up in the non-EU channel and wait ages and ages and ages, have your passport stamped so that you don't stay more than 90 days and 180 days and so on. And things like roaming charges, and a lot of phone companies are now, they're free to, if they want to introduce roaming charges, make it more expensive. You need to have medical insurance because in some cases, some places you go, your medical charges are not going to be covered if anything goes wrong with you whilst you're in the EU. So everything is much more complicated. In fact, you can't even take a ham sandwich to the EU now. And if you think back how, as members of the EU, we were involved in setting the standards. We made most of these laws. Virtually no laws were made that we didn't approve of. And we were really influential, important members of the EU. But now, if we want to do business in the EU, if we want to travel to the EU, we have to do what we're told. We have to obey their rules. We have become, now we've taken back control, we've become rule takers rather than rule makers, which is what we were before. And in terms of the overall economic effects, previously we were part of the biggest, richest, most successful trading bloc in the world. Now we're outside on our own, dreaming about economic superpowers, technology superpowers. Our exports to the EU are down 15%. Inward investment is down. Our GDP is estimated to fall by at least 4% a year as a direct result of Brexit. OECD forecasts that we'd be 19th slowest growing out of 20 countries next year. And the IMF has today forecast that we will be the only major economy in the world which will actually shrink next year. And that includes Russia, whose economy is expected to grow next year. So, all in all, that's what Brexit has done for us. That is where we are, and we're out on our own. No idea what's going to happen. All we know, every one of us, all we know is that things are going to get worse. The only people who've benefited from Brexit are people who've got lots and lots of money in tax havens who are not going to have to declare that money, or that money's not going to be subject to any scrutiny by as a result of what was proposed EU legislation whilst we were members. So that's Brexit in a nutshell. The whole thing is in here if you're interested. It's available on my website. The address is ml44.com, and if you watched this far, thank you very much, and till next time, bye for now.